When we look up at the night sky, the glittering points of light seem to belong to a world far beyond our reach, yet they have always been a mirror for the human soul. Carl Sagan, the astronomer-poet who brought the cosmos into living rooms across the globe, never treated the heavens as a distant backdrop. For him, the universe was a laboratory for philosophy, a vast canvas upon which the questions of meaning, responsibility, and humility could be drawn in bold, luminous strokes. To understand the foundations of Sagan's worldview, we must first trace the intellectual lineage that shaped his mind, beginning with the mentors and scientific revolutions that opened his eyes to the profound interconnectedness of all things. Sagan's early academic journey was anchored in the fertile soil of mid-20th century astronomy, a period when the very scale of the universe was being rewritten. As a young graduate student at the University of Chicago, he fell under the tutelage of Harlow Shapley, the astronomer who, in 1919, famously argued that the Milky Way was not the entire universe but merely one of countless galaxies. Shapley's declaration that the universe is a much larger place than we ever imagined resonated deeply with Sagan, who later recalled in a 1975 interview that Shapley's lectures made me feel like a child who had just been handed a key to a door that opened onto an endless hallway. That sense of awe, that sudden expansion of perspective, became a cornerstone of Sagan's philosophical stance. The cosmos is not a stage for humanity, but a vast arena in which humanity is a fleeting, though remarkably conscious, participant. Another pivotal influence arrived from the British physicist-cosmologist James Jeans, whose poetic musings on the nature of reality blended scientific rigor with lyrical wonder. In his 1928 work The Mysterious Universe, Jeans wrote, "The universe is a great cosmic symphony, and we are but a fleeting note in its grand composition." Sagan carried this sentiment into his own writing, often echoing Jeans's balance of hard data and soft imagination. He once said, "Science is more than a body of knowledge, it is a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the world." This synthesis of empirical inquiry and poetic reflection would later become the hallmark of Sagan's public philosophy. The Apollo era, with its thunderous rockets and moonlit footprints, provided the dramatic backdrop against which Sagan's ideas were forged. As a consultant to NASA, he helped design the experiments that would be carried aboard the Apollo missions, including the lunar laser-ranging retroreflectors that still bounce photons across the void today. The triumph of landing a human on the moon in 1969 was more than a technological milestone. It was a cultural watershed that forced humanity to confront its place in the solar system. Sagan captured this moment in his 1994 book Pale Blue Dot, writing, "Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us." The Apollo missions, therefore, were not merely feats of engineering. They were the crucible in which Sagan forged his cosmic humility, a humility that would later become both his greatest strength and the source of his most vocal critics. One of the most enduring metaphors that Sagan introduced to the public consciousness is the pale blue dot. In 1990, the Voyager 1 spacecraft, having completed its primary mission, turned its camera back toward Earth from a distance of about 3.7 billion miles. The resulting image showed Earth as a tiny speck, no larger than a pixel, suspended in a shaft of sunlight. Sagan, who wrote the accompanying caption for the Nature journal, turned that image into a philosophical revelation. That's one of the most beautiful pictures ever taken. It is a reminder that we are not only on this planet, but also that we are part of a larger, interconnected cosmos. The pale blue dot became a visual shorthand for the idea that the grandeur of the universe dwarfs human concerns, while simultaneously underscoring our unique capacity to reflect on that very insignificance. Closely linked to the pale blue dot is the concept of the cosmic calendar, a pedagogical device Sagan employed to compress the 13.8 billion-year history of the universe into a single calendar year. In this framework, the Big Bang occurs at midnight on January 1st, and each subsequent epoch, stellar formation, the emergence of life, the rise of dinosaurs, occupies a fraction of a day. Humanity, in this analogy, appears only in the final seconds of December 31st. Sagan used this calendar in countless lectures, inviting listeners to feel the weight of time and to recognize that the entire recorded history of human civilization occupies the last 24 hours of a year that began with the birth of the universe. The cosmic calendar is more than an educational tool. It is a philosophical lens that forces us to confront the fleeting nature of our species and the responsibility that comes with being the only known consciousness capable of contemplating its own brief moment. The Voyager Golden Record offers a concrete embodiment of Sagan's belief that humanity's story must be shared with the cosmos. In 1977, as the twin Voyager spacecraft were launched toward the outer planets, Sagan served as the chairman of the committee that curated this 12-inch gold-plated phonograph record. The record contains a curated selection of sounds, earthly greetings in 55 languages, the chirping of crickets, the roar of a volcano, and a suite of musical pieces ranging from Bach's Brandenburg Concerto to the haunting chant of a Navajo night song. Sagan wrote in the record's liner notes, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." The golden record, then, is not merely a time capsule. It is a philosophical statement that declares our existence as a means of cosmic self-recognition, a theme that reverberates throughout Sagan's later writings. The launch of Voyager itself is a historical anecdote that illustrates the convergence of scientific ambition and philosophical yearning. On September 5, 1977, at Cape Canaveral, the two rockets roared to life, their trajectories set not only to explore Jupiter and Saturn, but also to carry humanity's message into interstellar space. The launch was watched by a global audience, and Sagan, perched in the control room, felt the pulse of the universe beating in the engines. He later recalled that moment as a collective gasp, a shared breath held by billions as we sent our curiosity outward. The image of the rockets climbing into the night sky serves as a metaphor for the human impulse to reach beyond the known, a motif that recurs throughout Sagan's philosophical reflections. The second anecdote, set in 1995, concerns the public debate over the Hubble Space Telescope's budget. When NASA proposed a $1.5 billion upgrade, a chorus of politicians and taxpayers balked, questioning why such a luxury instrument deserved such an expense. Sagan entered the fray, arguing that Hubble was not a mere telescope but a window onto the deep past, a time machine that lets us read the history of the universe in the light of distant galaxies. He famously said, "The universe is not only stranger than we imagine. It is stranger than we can imagine. To deny ourselves the tools to explore it is to deny the very curiosity that makes us human." The debate ended with a renewed funding commitment, and Hubble went on to deliver images that would become iconic, most notably the Pillars of Creation. This episode underscores how Sagan's philosophical stance was not confined to abstract musings. It was a practical argument for the allocation of resources toward the pursuit of knowledge. Yet Sagan's cosmic humility has not escaped criticism. Some philosophers and cultural commentators argue that his emphasis on the insignificance of humanity in the vastness of space risks eroding a sense of human purpose. In a 1996 essay, the literary critic Harold Bloom wrote, "When we are reduced to a mote of dust, the very idea of meaning seems to evaporate." Others, more directly, have accused Sagan of cosmic nihilism, suggesting that his view that we are a fragile blue marble suspended in a sunbeam could lead to moral paralysis. In response, Sagan drew upon both scientific evidence and ethical reasoning. He contended that recognizing our smallness does not diminish our capacity for significance. Rather, it magnifies the responsibility we bear for the planet we share. He wrote, "Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity and our smallness, there is a profound responsibility to cherish what we have." By framing humility as a catalyst for stewardship, Sagan turned the critique on its head, arguing that the very awareness of our fragility is what makes our choices morally weighty. A second line of criticism comes from religious thinkers who claim that Sagan's secular, materialist perspective marginalizes spiritual dimensions of human experience. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, for instance, warned that a universe stripped of divine purpose could lead to a moral vacuum. Sagan addressed this concern directly in his 1985 Cosmos series, noting that the awe inspired by the night sky is a kind of reverence that does not require a deity, but is no less profound. He quoted the poet William Blake, saying, "To see a world in a grain of sand," and argued that the sense of wonder is a universal human trait, transcending religious boundaries. By invoking the shared emotional response to the cosmos, Sagan positioned his philosophy as a bridge rather than a barrier, inviting both believers and skeptics to find common ground in the mystery of existence. To deepen this bridge, we can cross-reference Sagan's ideas with the ancient Stoic concept of the cosmic city, or cosmopolis. The Stoics, especially Marcus Aurelius, wrote of humanity as citizens of a universal community, bound together by reason and the natural order. Marcus observed, "The universe is change, our life is what our thoughts make it." Sagan's cosmic perspective echoes this sentiment. By recognizing that we inhabit a single planet within a vast universe, we are called to act as global citizens, caring for the shared environment that sustains us. The Stoic emphasis on living in accordance with nature aligns with contemporary environmental ethics, which argue that humanity must adopt a planetary stewardship ethic. Sagan's famous admonition, "We are the custodians of a fragile oasis," can be read as a modern articulation of the Stoic duty to preserve the common good, extending the ancient idea of cosmopolis into the realm of planetary science. The practical implications of this philosophy are evident in modern environmental movements. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, frequently cites the pale blue dot as a visual reminder of Earth's vulnerability. In a 2021 UN report, the lead author wrote, "When we view our planet from the perspective of space, the urgency of climate action becomes undeniable." Sagan's cosmic humility thus becomes a rallying cry for climate justice, urging policymakers to consider the long-term health of the only known cradle of life. Moreover, the concept of the cosmic calendar has been adopted by educators to illustrate the rapid acceleration of human impact in the final minutes of the year, reinforcing the message that our actions now will shape the final chapters of Earth's story. Sagan also engaged directly with the notion of human significance through his discussion of the overview effect, a term later coined by astronaut Frank White to describe the cognitive shift experienced by astronauts when viewing Earth from orbit. Sagan's description of the pale blue dot anticipates this effect, suggesting that the sight of Earth as a tiny, fragile sphere can inspire a profound sense of unity and responsibility. He wrote, "When you look at the Earth, you see a fragile oasis, a place that is both a cradle and a tomb." This observation has been used by space agencies to argue for the inclusion of space-based education programs, asserting that the perspective gained from orbit can foster a planetary ethic that transcends national borders. In his later years, Sagan turned his attention to the question of extraterrestrial intelligence, a topic that further illustrates the interplay between his scientific background and philosophical outlook. In the 1972 Contact Symposium, he argued that the discovery of alien life would not diminish humanity's uniqueness, but rather expand our understanding of consciousness. He famously said, "If we are alone, we are a lonely universe. If we are not, then we are part of a larger community of beings, each with its own story." This stance reflects a nuanced view. Cosmic humility does not entail existential despair, but invites a broader, inclusive sense of belonging. The Voyager Golden Record, once again, serves as a concrete illustration of this inclusive vision. By selecting a diverse array of sounds and music from Earth, Sagan and his colleagues asserted that humanity's story is a mosaic of cultures, each contributing a voice to the cosmic chorus. He explained that the record's purpose was to show that we are not a monolithic species, but a tapestry of experiences, emotions, and aspirations. This message resonates with contemporary discussions about cultural preservation in the age of globalization, reminding us that the cosmic perspective should not erase diversity, but celebrate it. Turning to the counterarguments once more, we find a third line of critique emerging from the field of existential psychology. Scholars such as Viktor Frankl have argued that meaning is derived from purposeful engagement, not from cosmic scale. Frankl wrote, "Man's search for meaning is a primary motivational force." Critics claim that Sagan's emphasis on the vastness of the universe could lead individuals to feel that their personal narratives are inconsequential. Sagan anticipated this concern in his 1995 essay, The Demon-Haunted World, where he wrote, "Science gives us the tools to understand the world, philosophy gives us the tools to understand ourselves within it." He suggested that the cosmic perspective is a backdrop, not a replacement for personal meaning. By integrating scientific understanding with a humanistic ethic, Sagan offered a synthesis. The universe is immense, yet we're capable of creating meaning through love, curiosity, and ethical action. One of the most compelling analogies Sagan used to convey this synthesis was that of a river flowing through a vast canyon. He imagined Earth as a river, our biosphere, carving its path through the canyon walls of the universe. The canyon is indifferent, ancient, and unchanging, while the river is dynamic, full of life, and constantly reshaping its banks. The river cannot alter the canyon's size, but it can influence the shape of its own channel. In this analogy, the canyon represents the cosmic scale, and the river embodies human agency. Sagan would pause, letting the image settle before concluding, "We cannot change the canyon, but we can choose how we navigate the river." This metaphor captures the essence of his philosophy. Humility before the cosmos, coupled with responsibility for the immediate environment we inhabit. Sagan's influence extends into contemporary scientific communication. The popular series Cosmos, a spacetime odyssey hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson, explicitly draws upon Sagan's narrative techniques, using the cosmic calendar and pale blue dot imagery to inspire a new generation. In an interview, Tyson remarked, "Sagan taught us that the story of the universe is also the story of us, and that the best way to understand that story is to tell it with wonder and rigor." This lineage demonstrates how Sagan's philosophical framework continues to shape public discourse, reinforcing the idea that scientific literacy and ethical reflection are inseparable. The modern environmental ethic of deep ecology, championed by philosophers such as Arne Naess, finds an unexpected ally in Sagan's cosmic perspective. Deep ecology posits that all living beings have intrinsic value, independent of their utility to humans. Sagan's description of Earth as a lonely speck that carries the only known life in the universe resonates with the deep ecological principle that the biosphere's preservation is a moral imperative, not a utilitarian calculation. By framing Earth's uniqueness in cosmic terms, Sagan provided a scientific foundation for arguments that life itself is precious, thereby strengthening calls for biodiversity conservation. In the realm of space policy, Sagan's ideas have been invoked to argue for the responsible exploration of other worlds. The 2014 International Space Exploration Policy, ISEP, cites the pale blue dot as an ethical touchstone, urging that any human activity beyond Earth must respect the integrity of extraterrestrial environments. Sagan's own words, "We must be careful not to become the cosmic colonizers who repeat the mistakes of our terrestrial history," serve as a guiding principle for contemporary debates about planetary protection and the ethics of terraforming. To bring the discussion full circle, let us return to the image of the Voyager golden record, now traveling through interstellar space for perhaps billions of years. Its coppery surface, etched with the sounds of whales, the laughter of children, and the rhythm of a heartbeat, is a testament to humanity's desire to be known. Sagan believed that by sending this record we were saying, "We exist, we think, we feel." In doing so, he demonstrated that humility does not preclude expression. Rather, it provides the context in which our expression becomes meaningful. The record is both a scientific artifact and a philosophical proclamation that even a speck of dust can speak across the void. As we contemplate the pale blue dot today, with the Hubble and James Webb telescopes revealing galaxies in unprecedented detail, the question remains, how do we let this cosmic perspective shape our daily lives? Sagan would likely answer with a series of reflective pauses, inviting us to consider the small but vital actions that constitute stewardship. He would ask, will we look at the night sky, and when we think of Carl Sagan, the image that often comes to mind is that of a poet-astronomer, his voice drifting over the void, inviting us to look up and marvel at the cosmos. Yet beneath the lyrical cadence of his verses lies a rigor that is unmistakably philosophical, a conviction that science is not merely a toolbox for predicting the motion of planets, but a moral enterprise, a disciplined habit of mind that obliges us to question, to doubt, and to hold ourselves accountable to the evidence of the world. In this segment, we will walk through the roots of that conviction, trace its articulation in Sagan's own writing, examine the historical moments that tested it, and confront the criticisms that have been leveled against it. By the end, you may find that the call to skepticism is not a cold, detached dismissal of wonder, but a compassionate duty to protect truth, to safeguard society, and to honor the very humanity that gazes at the night sky. Sagan's insistence that scientific skepticism is an ethical stance finds its most explicit expression in his 1995 book, The Demon-Haunted World: Science as a Candle in the Dark. He writes, "Science is more than a body of knowledge, it is a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the world around us." For Sagan, the act of questioning is not an optional garnish on the cake of discovery. It is the yeast that makes the whole thing rise. He frames this as a moral imperative, a duty that each of us bears because we share a common planet, a common future, and a common capacity for reason. The moral dimension is woven through his baloney detection kit, a concise list of cognitive tools designed to cut through the fog of misinformation. The kit begins, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," a maxim that has become a shorthand for the entire skeptical enterprise. To understand why Sagan elevated skepticism to the level of ethics, we must look back to the Enlightenment, when philosophers first articulated the public use of reason as a civic virtue. Immanuel Kant, in his 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment?, famously declared, "Sapere aude, have the courage to use your own understanding without the guidance of another." Kant argued that the public deployment of reason, open, critical, and communal, was essential for the progress of humanity. Sagan, though a 20th century astrophysicist, saw himself standing on that same balcony, peering over the crowd of believers, doubters, and charlatans, urging each listener to dare to know. He extended Kant's call beyond the realm of politics and religion into the burgeoning arena of modern media, where the speed of information could amplify both truth and falsehood with equal ferocity. The modern philosophy of science provides further scaffolding for Sagan's stance. Karl Popper, in The Logic of Scientific Discovery, proposed falsifiability as the demarcation criterion separating science from pseudoscience. Popper's insight was that a theory's strength lies not in its ability to predict, but in its vulnerability to being proven wrong. Thomas Kuhn later complicated this picture by showing how scientific revolutions are not merely linear accumulations of facts, but paradigm shifts that reshape what counts as a legitimate question. Sagan absorbed both insights. He championed the Popperian vigilance that no claim should be immune to testing, while also recognizing, through Kuhn, that the cultural context of a paradigm can make skepticism itself a contested practice. In this way, his baloney detection kit can be seen as a portable Popperian falsifiability test, calibrated for the everyday citizen navigating a Kuhnian landscape of shifting scientific narratives. Let us now turn to the concrete arguments Sagan advances in The Demon-Haunted World. He begins by diagnosing a cultural malaise, a world where the supernatural is not merely a relic of a pre-rational age, but a thriving industry that profits from our fear of the unknown. He identifies 3 pillars of the skeptical ethic. First, the demand for evidence, articulated in his famous maxim about extraordinary claims. Second, the recognition of cognitive biases, what he calls the human brain's tendency to see patterns where none exist. Third, the responsibility to communicate, to translate the language of evidence into stories that can be heard by the public. Sagan insists that without the third pillar, the first 2 remain inert. Evidence and bias analysis must be shared, lest they become a private luxury for the academic elite. Consider the first pillar in action during the UFO hysteria of the 1970s. The United States, fresh from the space race, found itself awash in reports of flying saucers, alien abductions, and government cover-ups. Television shows, tabloid newspapers, and even some members of Congress began to treat these reports as credible threats. Sagan entered the fray not with a dismissive sneer, but with a methodical application of his own kit. He urged the public to ask, what is the source of the evidence? Are there independent corroborations? Is there a plausible mechanism consistent with known physics? He pointed out that many of the alleged sightings could be explained by atmospheric phenomena, misidentified aircraft, or even psychological suggestibility. In a 1977 interview, he remarked, "The universe is a pretty big place. If it were full of alien visitors, we would have seen far more than a handful of blurry photographs and anecdotal testimonies." His calm, reflective tone served as a counterweight to the sensationalism, reminding listeners that the burden of proof rests on the claimant, not on the skeptic. The second pillar, recognizing bias, was equally vital during the anti-vaccination movement of the 1990s. In the wake of Andrew Wakefield's discredited study linking the measles, mumps, rubella (MMR) vaccine to autism, a wave of parental fear spread across the globe. The fear was amplified by emotional narratives, selective statistics, and a distrust of pharmaceutical institutions. Sagan's response was to highlight the epidemiological data, to demonstrate how the incidence of autism had risen even as vaccination rates remained high, and to explain the concept of correlation does not imply causation. He used the analogy of a lighthouse. Skepticism is the light that pierces the fog of anecdote, guiding ships away from the rocks of misinformation. By framing the issue in terms of a shared moral duty, protecting the most vulnerable children, Sagan turned a technical debate into an ethical conversation, urging parents to consider not only the risk to their own child, but the collective risk to the community. Historical anecdotes illustrate how Sagan's skepticism was tested in the political arena. In 1974, the United States Senate convened a hearing on the so-called Mars effect, a claim by French psychologist Michel Gauquelin that the positions of certain planets at the time of a person's birth could predict athletic prowess. The claim, if true, would have shaken the foundations of both astrology and the scientific method. Sagan, then a young researcher at Cornell, was invited to testify before the committee. He did not dismiss the claim outright. Instead, he asked for the data, for the statistical methods, and for replication studies. He pointed out that the sample size was small, that selection bias could not be ruled out, and that the alleged effect vanished when the data were reanalyzed with proper controls. The Senate ultimately concluded that the evidence was insufficient to warrant further governmental investigation. Sagan's measured, evidence-based approach exemplified his belief that even the most sensational claims deserve a fair, rigorous examination, one that neither indulges credulity nor resorts to outright ridicule. A second anecdote, perhaps more widely known, concerns Sagan's role in the production of the 1978 television series Cosmos, A Personal Voyage. The series was a bold attempt to bring the wonder of the universe into living rooms across the world. Yet behind the poetic narration lay a fierce commitment to scientific accuracy. when the producers suggested dramatizing the ancient astronaut hypothesis, an idea that extraterrestrials had visited Earth in antiquity, to boost ratings, Sagan refused. He argued that presenting unverified speculation as fact would betray the very audience he hoped to enlighten. He insisted on a no-fiction dressed as fact policy, even if it meant sacrificing a dramatic moment. The result was a series that combined awe-inspiring visuals with a steadfast adherence to evidence, setting a new standard for popular science communication. Sagan's insistence that the public deserved truth, not sensationalism, illustrates how his skeptical ethic guided not only his writing, but his choices in media production. Now let us turn to the counterarguments that have been raised against Sagan's brand of skepticism. The first criticism contends that extreme skepticism can degenerate into cynicism, a kind of intellectual nihilism that dismisses not only pseudoscience but also legitimate scientific progress. Critics argue that by constantly questioning, we risk eroding trust in expertise, leaving the public adrift in a sea of relativism. Sagan anticipated this charge. In The Demon-Haunted World, he wrote, "The point of a skeptical attitude is not to deny the possibility of truth, but to demand a higher standard of proof before we accept it." He distinguished between healthy doubt, an engine of inquiry, and corrosive doubt, a barrier to knowledge. He warned that the latter often stems from a misplaced belief that all claims are equally untrustworthy, a stance that can be weaponized by those who wish to undermine scientific consensus on climate change, public health, or nuclear safety. Sagan's remedy was to pair skepticism with humility, to acknowledge that our current models are provisional, while still insisting that they are the best tools we have for navigating the world. In this way, his approach seeks a balance, a middle path that preserves the integrity of inquiry without surrendering to nihilism. The second accusation is that Sagan's popularization of science diluted its rigor, turning complex concepts into soft entertainment. Some academics have claimed that his poetic language and television-friendly narratives sacrificed nuance, potentially misrepresenting the provisional nature of scientific theories. Sagan addressed this critique directly in a 1990 essay for Science magazine, where he wrote, "If we do not make the wonders of the universe accessible, we invite the darkness of superstition to fill the void." He argued that the trade-off between accessibility and depth is not a zero-sum game. Rather, it is a matter of scaffolding. By first presenting the big picture, why the stars matter, why the laws of physics matter, he creates a foundation upon which deeper, more technical learning can be built. He likened this to a ladder of curiosity. The first rung is a vivid, relatable story. The higher rungs are the rigorous mathematics and experimental details. In this metaphor, the ladder does not replace the higher rungs. It simply helps more people climb toward them. Moreover, Sagan was meticulous in his footnotes and citations, often including references to peer-reviewed studies even in his popular works. He saw no contradiction in being both a poet of the cosmos and a guardian of its methodological integrity. To appreciate how Sagan's skeptical ethic resonates today, we can look at modern interpretations that draw on his legacy. The rise of science communication as a professional field owes a debt to his model of clear, compassionate storytelling grounded in evidence. Organizations such as the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, CSI, echo his baloney detection kit in their guidelines for evaluating extraordinary claims. In the digital age, the same tools are being adapted to combat misinformation on social media platforms, where algorithms amplify sensationalist content. Scholars like Michael Shermer have expanded Sagan's kit, adding items like "look for logical fallacies" and "consider the source's track record." At the same time, philosophers of science like Ian Hacking have revisited Sagan's ideas, arguing that the moral dimension of skepticism is crucial for what Hacking calls the social construction of scientific facts. In this view, the public's capacity to question is not a peripheral curiosity, but a central component of how scientific knowledge becomes solidified in society. Real-world applications of Sagan's approach can be seen in contemporary public health campaigns. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Health Organization and national health agencies deployed infodemic response teams that used Sagan-style checklists to evaluate rumors about treatments, vaccine side effects, and origin theories. These checklists echo the extraordinary claim principle, demanding randomized controlled trials before any claim about a drug's efficacy is accepted. The same methodology was applied to debunk the 2014 Ebola vaccine hoax that claimed the virus was a bioweapon. By insisting on transparent data, peer review, and reproducibility, these efforts embodied the ethical responsibility that Sagan attached to skepticism, protecting lives through rigorous inquiry. Analogies can help us see why skepticism is more than a mental habit, it is a social safeguard. Imagine a community garden where each member contributes seeds, water, and labor. If a single gardener claims that a mysterious miracle fertilizer will double the harvest overnight, the community faces a choice. Accept the claim without testing and risk contaminating the soil, wasting resources, and eroding trust among neighbors. Apply Sagan's baloney detection kit, inspect the ingredient list, seek independent verification, run a small pilot plot, and the community protects its collective well-being while remaining open to genuine innovation. In this garden, skepticism is the compost that enriches the soil, not the weeds that choke growth. Another analogy draws from music. A symphony is composed of many instruments, each following a score that has been rehearsed, refined, and critiqued. If a new composer proposes a piece that claims to redefine harmony by abandoning all tonal conventions, the orchestra must decide whether to perform it as written. A skeptical approach does not dismiss the piece outright. It asks the composer to demonstrate how the new structure creates coherence, to provide a rehearsal where the musicians can test the sound, and to explain how listeners might find meaning in the departure from tradition. If the piece passes these tests, it may enrich the repertoire. If not, the orchestra preserves its standards. This musical metaphor mirrors Sagan's view that skepticism is a collaborative rehearsal, a process that refines ideas before they are presented to the public stage. Returning to the philosophical lineage, Kant's public use of reason demands that we bring our doubts into the public square, not hide them behind closed doors. Popper's falsifiability tells us that the strongest theories are those that have survived attempts at refutation. Kuhn reminds us that paradigms shift and that skepticism can be a catalyst for those shifts. Sagan weaves these threads together, proposing that the moral enterprise of science is to keep the public square vibrant, to test ideas relentlessly, and to remain open to transformation while guarding against the erosion of trust. He sees the candle in the dark not as a solitary flame, but as a beacon that invites others to gather around, to share its light, and to keep it burning through collective vigilance. Let us pause for a moment and reflect on the words Sagan chose to crystallize his ethic. He wrote, "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love." Yet he added, "Love of the cosmos must be coupled with love of evidence." In another passage he observed, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." These lines capture the paradox at the heart of his philosophy. The same awe that draws us to the stars can also make us vulnerable to illusion, and only a disciplined, compassionate skepticism can reconcile the two. The balance is delicate, but it is precisely what makes the moral enterprise of science both demanding and rewarding. When we examine the two historical episodes, the Senate hearing on the Mars effect and the production of Cosmos, we see Sagan applying his kit in very different arenas. In the Senate, his skepticism was a tool of civic responsibility, ensuring that public funds were not misallocated to a claim lacking empirical support. In Cosmos, his skepticism became a production principle, safeguarding the integrity of a narrative meant to inspire. In both cases, the underlying ethic remained the same: a duty to the audience, whether they are lawmakers or television viewers, to present the best possible version of reality, unvarnished by superstition, yet delivered with the poetic grace that makes it memorable. The modern landscape offers fresh challenges that test the limits of Sagan's framework. The 2020s have seen the rise of deepfake technology, which can fabricate video evidence that appears indistinguishable from genuine footage. A skeptical toolkit that once relied on visual inspection now demands digital forensic methods, algorithmic verification, and an awareness of the socio-technical context in which such media are produced. Yet the core principle remains unchanged. Extraordinary claims, such as a video of a political leader delivering a speech from a distant galaxy, require extraordinary evidence, and the burden of proof stays with the claimant. Sagan's emphasis on transparency, on providing the raw data for independent verification, is when we look up at the night sky and imagine the thin blue line of our atmosphere, we are simultaneously confronted with two profound questions. What moral obligations do we carry as we reach beyond our home planet, and how do those obligations shape the very way we imagine the future of humanity? Carl Sagan, the astronomer-poet who taught a generation to see the universe as a mirror for ourselves, devoted much of his later work to articulating a moral framework for space exploration. He did not treat the cosmos as a distant backdrop for technological triumphs. He treated it as a shared heritage, a cosmic community in which every act of discovery reverberates with ethical significance. In this segment, we will trace the origins of Sagan's thinking, examine the key arguments he offered, explore the counter-arguments that have emerged, and ground the discussion in concrete cases, most notably the Viking lander experiments on Mars and the 2009 debate over private lunar mining. Along the way, we will hear the voices of history, from the engineers who first whispered life to the scientists who warned don't contaminate, and we will cross-reference Kant's Kingdom of Ends, contemporary bioethical debates about terraforming, and the enduring question of whether humanity can be a responsible steward of worlds it has never touched. Sagan's moral imagination was rooted in a particular moment of scientific history. In the early 1970s, as the United States prepared to send the Viking landers to Mars, the scientific community faced a dilemma that was both technical and ethical. The Viking missions were designed not only to photograph the Martian surface, but also to conduct a series of biochemical experiments that might detect living organisms. The very act of probing another planet for life raised the specter of contamination, both forward contamination, where Earth microbes could hitch a ride to another world, and backward contamination, where alien life could be brought back to Earth. In the words of the Viking science team, we must be careful that our presence does not alter the very phenomena we seek to study. This concern was not abstract. It was codified in the planetary protection protocols that NASA adopted in 1967, protocols that would become a living document throughout Sagan's career. Carl Sagan entered this debate not as a mission engineer, but as a philosopher of science. In a 1976 interview with the New York Times, he articulated a vision that would become a cornerstone of his ethical framework. If we are to become a spacefaring civilization, we must learn to be good stewards of the cosmos. The same curiosity that drives us to the stars must also drive us to protect them. For Sagan, the ethical stakes of exploration were inseparable from the scientific stakes. He believed that the pursuit of knowledge carried with it a responsibility to preserve the integrity of the environments we study. This view resonates with the ancient principle of prima non nocere, first, do no harm, reframed for an interplanetary context. To understand Sagan's moral calculus, we must consider the three pillars upon which he built his argument. The first pillar is humility. Sagan repeatedly reminded us that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. This poetic line from his Cosmos series underscores a relational humility. We are not masters of the universe, but participants in a grand, unfolding conversation. The second pillar is responsibility. In a 1994 essay titled The Moral Imperative of Space Exploration, Sagan wrote, "Our reach must be matched by our restraint. The expansion of our presence must be accompanied by an expansion of our ethical imagination." The third pillar is stewardship, a notion that draws heavily on ecological ethics. Sagan argued that just as we have a duty to protect Earth's fragile ecosystems, we must extend that duty to any environment we encounter, whether it be the dusty plains of Mars or the icy craters of Europa. These pillars are not merely philosophical abstractions. They find concrete expression in the Viking lander experiments of 1976. The Viking 1 and Viking 2 spacecraft each carried three primary biological experiments. The labeled release LR, the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer GCMS, and the pyrolytic release PR. The LR experiment, designed by Gilbert Levin, added a nutrient solution tagged with radioactive carbon to Martian soil samples and measured whether any gas was released, a potential sign of metabolic activity. When the first results came back, the data showed a rapid release of radioactive gas, which some interpreted as a tantalizing hint of life. Yet the GCMS failed to detect any organic molecules, leading most scientists to conclude that the LR results were chemical artifacts rather than evidence of biology. Sagan's response to this controversy was measured but firm. He warned that we must not rush to celebrate a false positive, nor must we dismiss a genuine signal because it challenges our expectations. He emphasized the need for rigorous planetary protection protocols, insisting that any future missions must avoid contaminating the Martian surface with Earth microbes, lest we create a false signal in the next generation of experiments. The Viking case thus illustrates Sagan's first pillar, humility, in that it cautions us against overconfidence in our interpretations, and his second pillar, responsibility, by urging the scientific community to safeguard the integrity of future data. Fast forward 3 decades to 2009, when the conversation about planetary protection shifted from government agencies to private enterprises. The United States passed the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which granted companies the right to own and sell resources extracted from celestial bodies. This legislation ignited a fierce debate. Could private lunar mining coexist with planetary protection, or would it open the door to a gold rush that disregards ethical constraints? Proponents argued from a utilitarian perspective, emphasizing the potential benefits of lunar helium-3 for clean energy, the economic stimulus of a new industry, and the inspirational value of human expansion beyond Earth. Critics invoking Sagan's stewardship ethic warned that the lunar environment is a scientific archive. Once disturbed, the record of its early history could be lost forever. In a 2009 panel organized by the Planetary Society, Sagan's words were invoked repeatedly. One participant quoted Sagan's 1995 pale blue dot passage, "The Earth is a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. To me, it underscores the responsibility we have to preserve the fragile ecosystems that make life possible." Another speaker cited Sagan's 1997 testimony before the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, where he stated, "The exploitation of extraterrestrial resources must be guided by a framework that respects the intrinsic value of these bodies, not merely their instrumental value to us." These references illustrate how Sagan's moral framework continues to shape policy discussions, even when he was not physically present to argue his case. To explore the depth of the ethical terrain, we must turn to two major counter-arguments that have risen in the decades since Sagan first articulated his vision. The first is a utilitarian argument for resource exploitation, which posits that the greatest good for the greatest number may require the extraction of extraterrestrial minerals. Proponents argue that Earth's finite resources are under unprecedented strain. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and geopolitical competition over rare earth elements all point to a pressing need for new sources. From this perspective, the Moon's regolith, rich in helium-3, and the asteroid belt's metal ores could provide a sustainable supply of energy and materials, reducing the ecological footprint of terrestrial mining. Utilitarian ethicists such as Peter Singer have suggested that if the benefits of space mining can alleviate suffering on Earth, the moral calculus may tilt in favor of exploitation, even if it entails some disturbance of pristine environments. The second counter-argument is deontological, drawing directly from Immanuel Kant's notion of the kingdom of ends. Kant writes, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, applied to planetary protection. This principle demands that we treat celestial bodies not merely as means to an end, but as ends in themselves, worthy of respect regardless of their utility to humanity." From this standpoint, the act of mining the Moon without consent, since there is no consent, constitutes a violation of a universal moral law that forbids the exploitation of entities that cannot consent. Moreover, Kant's kingdom of ends envisions a community of rational agents who legislate moral law for each other. Extending this community to include future generations and even non-human planetary systems demands that we preserve the integrity of extraterrestrial environments for their own sake. These two counter-arguments set up a classic ethical tension. Does the potential benefit to billions of present and future humans outweigh the duty to preserve untouched worlds? Sagan navigated this tension by proposing a middle path, one that he described as a planetary ethic that is both ambitious and restrained. He suggested that we could develop a tiered approach to planetary protection, similar to the way we manage protected areas on Earth. For instance, the International Astronomical Union could designate certain lunar sites of high scientific value as preservation zones, while allowing limited, carefully regulated extraction in less critical regions. This approach mirrors Earth's biosphere reserves, where human activity is permitted under strict guidelines that prioritize ecological integrity. The analogy of a museum helps to illuminate this idea. Imagine the Moon as a priceless museum of the solar system's early history. Some galleries, such as the South Pole Aitken Basin, contain artifacts that could answer fundamental questions about planetary formation. Others, like the relatively featureless mare regions, are akin to storage rooms that could be repurposed for practical use without destroying irreplaceable exhibits. By treating the Moon as a museum, we acknowledge both its cultural and scientific value, while recognizing that some spaces may be responsibly utilized. Sagan often used such analogies to make abstract concepts tangible. In Cosmos, he likened the universe to a vast library, where each world is a book that deserves to be read without being ripped apart. The 2015 announcement of SpaceX's Mars ambitions provides a vivid, contemporary illustration of Sagan's influence on public imagination and ethical discourse. When Elon Musk unveiled his plan to send a fleet of Starship rockets to Mars, Sagan's voice was invoked in multiple media interviews. In a 2015 Cosmos episode rebroadcast, Sagan's former colleague, Andrewian, remarked, Carl would have been thrilled by the ingenuity of the plan, but he would also have asked, what kind of Martian society do we want to build? Will we respect the planet's natural state, or will we repeat the colonial mistakes of Earth? This question echoes Sagan's caution that the future we imagine must be a future we are willing to steward, not a future we are willing to dominate. Sagan's concern extended beyond the physical act of landing on a planet. It encompassed the cultural and philosophical implications of colonization. He warned that the colonizing impulse, if unchecked, can turn new worlds into extensions of old hierarchies. In a 1998 lecture at the University of Arizona, he said, "We must ask ourselves whether we are going to be the caretakers of a new world or the conquerors of it." This sentiment anticipates contemporary debates about terraforming, a process that would deliberately alter a planet's atmosphere, climate, and geology to make it more Earth-like. Proponents argue that terraforming is a moral imperative to ensure humanity's survival. Critics counter that it is an act of hubris that disregards the intrinsic value of alien ecosystems, however minimal they may be. Modern bioethical discussions on terraforming often invoke the principle of non-maleficence, a cornerstone of medical ethics that mandates avoiding harm. Bioethicist Michael J. Seljalid, in his 2012 paper, The Ethics of Planetary Engineering, writes, terraforming raises the same ethical questions as any medical intervention. Who consents, who benefits, and who bears the risks? By framing terraforming as a form of planetary surgery, Seljalid draws a direct line to Sagan's stewardship ethic. If we consider the planet as a patient, then the surgeon must obtain informed consent, something impossible with a non-sentient world, suggesting a deontological constraint on large-scale alteration. This line of reasoning dovetails with Kant's kingdom of ends. Even in the absence of agency, the moral law demands respect for the inherent value of the planetary system. Returning to the Viking story, we find a historical anecdote that underscores Sagan's emphasis on caution. In 1976, after the LR experiment reported a positive result, the Viking team held a tense press conference. When asked whether they had discovered life, the mission's principal investigator, Dr. James B. Garvin, responded, "We are not yet sure. The data is intriguing, but we must be careful not to let excitement cloud scientific judgment." Sagan later reflected on this moment in a private letter to the team, writing, "Your restraint honors the very spirit of discovery. It is better to be wrong after careful thought than right by accident." This anecdote illustrates how Sagan's humility principle guided scientific communication, reinforcing the idea that ethical responsibility includes honest representation of uncertainty. A second anecdote from the 2015 SpaceX announcement shows how Sagan's legacy can shape public discourse. During a live Q&A, a journalist asked Musk whether humanity would be the next wave of colonizers who strip resources without regard for the host. Musk replied, "We aim to make life multiplanetary, not to exploit." In the same broadcast, Andrewian interjected, quoting Sagan, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself, and that knowledge comes with a duty to protect." The moment captured a living dialogue between the bold optimism of private enterprise and the cautious stewardship advocated by Sagan. It also highlighted how Sagan's words continue to serve as a moral compass, reminding innovators that ambition must be paired with humility. To further illuminate the practical implications of planetary protection, let us examine the current framework established by the Committee on Space Research, COSPAR. COSPAR classifies missions into 4 categories, Category I through IV, based on the probability of forward contamination and the scientific importance of the target. Category I missions, such as flybys of the Moon, require minimal protection, while Category IV missions, like sample return from Europa, demand the highest level of sterilization. Sagan was instrumental in shaping this tiered system, arguing that the level of protection should be proportional to the potential for scientific loss. By embedding a proportionality principle, Sagan's framework respects both the utilitarian desire for exploration and the deontological duty to preserve. Critics of the COSPAR system point out that it can be overly bureaucratic, potentially slowing progress. In a 2018 editorial in Scientific American, author and space policy analyst James Green argued, "The current planetary protection regime is a relic of the Cold War, and it may stifle the very innovation needed to address Earth's crises." He suggested a revised model that would allow controlled exposure of certain sites, akin to field trials in agriculture. Sagan might have welcomed such pragmatic proposals, but he would have insisted that any relaxation of standards be accompanied by robust scientific justification and transparent oversight. He once wrote, "Innovation without accountability is a ship without a rudder." The dialogue between utilitarian and deontological perspectives also finds resonance in contemporary discussions about the ethics of artificial intelligence in space. As autonomous rovers become more capable, they may make decisions about sample collection without direct human input. This raises the question, should an AI be programmed to prioritize planetary protection, or should it follow a cost-benefit algorithm that maximizes scientific return? Sagan's emphasis on a cosmic ethic suggests that any decision-making system, human or artificial, must embed the principle of respect for extraterrestrial environments as a non-negotiable constraint. This echoes the Kantian idea that certain maxims must be universalizable, regardless of instrumental gains. The conversation about planetary protection is not limited to Mars or the Moon. It extends to icy worlds like Europa and Enceladus, where subsurface oceans may harbor life. In 2018, the Europa Clipper mission proposal sparked a debate about whether to send a lander that could drill through the ice crust. Proponents argued that accessing the ocean would answer the age-old question of whether life exists elsewhere, a discovery that could transform humanity's self-understanding. Opponents warned that any contamination of the ocean could irreversibly alter its chemistry, destroying the very conditions that might support life. Sagan's legacy is evident in the cautious language of the mission's proponents, who cite his admonition. "We must be the guardians of the unknown, not the polluters of the pristine." To synthesize these threads, let us return to the three pillars of Sagan's ethical vision: humility, responsibility, stewardship, and see how they play out across the cases we have examined. In the Viking experiments, humility manifested as a willingness to accept ambiguity. Responsibility appeared in the rigorous sterilization protocols. Stewardship was reflected in the decision to leave the Martian surface largely untouched after the experiments concluded. In the 2009 lunar mining debate, humility was invoked by those urging caution about unintended consequences. Responsibility emerged in the call for transparent regulatory frameworks. Stewardship was embodied in the proposal for preservation zones. In the SpaceX Mars ambition, when we think of Carl Sagan, we often picture a man whose voice could turn the cold mathematics of orbital mechanics into a lullaby for the soul. Yet what made his voice so resonant was not merely its timbre, but the way he wove story and data together, as if each fact were a thread in a larger tapestry of wonder. He believed that science at its heart is a narrative, a story about how the universe began, how it evolves, and how we, fleeting specks of carbon, fit into that grand chronicle. In his own words, science is more than a body of knowledge, it is a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe. That opening line from the first episode of Cosmos is not a dry statement of purpose. It is an invitation to the audience to step into a shared imagination, to feel the awe that has driven humanity from the first fire to the launch of Voyager. The literary style Sagan cultivated was deliberately poetic, yet never at the expense of precision. He would begin a sentence with a metaphor, then anchor it with a concrete datum. Consider the opening monologue of Cosmos. The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. The phrase star stuff is a metaphor that captures the astrophysical truth that the elements in our bodies were forged in the cores of ancient stars. It is also a poetic image that lingers in the mind long after the episode ends. Sagan's use of metaphor was not a decorative flourish. It was a cognitive bridge, a way of translating the abstract into the visceral. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that the brain processes narratives more readily than isolated facts, a principle later confirmed by cognitive science. Sagan's essay, The Demon-Haunted World, offers another vivid illustration of his narrative technique. In the chapter titled The Fine Art of Baloney Detection, he writes of the golden record of the mind, a metaphorical repository where humanity stores its most cherished truths, myths, and discoveries. He likens the scientific method to a disciplined librarian, sorting out the baloney that threatens to contaminate that record. The image of a golden record is not accidental. It echoes the literal golden phonograph records Voyager carried into interstellar space. By aligning the metaphor with a tangible artifact, Sagan makes the abstract concept of intellectual integrity feel concrete, almost tactile. The essay's cadence, its rhythmic alternation between warning and encouragement, reads like a modern fable, reminding us that the fight against superstition is a story we must all help to tell. One of the most celebrated anecdotes that encapsulates Sagan's belief in narrative power occurred in 1994, when he delivered the Pale Blue Dot speech before the National Academy of Sciences. He began by showing a photograph taken by Voyager 1, a tiny speck of light suspended in a beam of sunlight, and then he spoke. "Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us," he continued. "Every human being who ever lived was here." The speech is a masterclass in scaling, from the astronomical to the intimate, from the photograph's pixel to the human heart. By framing the image as a story about our collective existence, Sagan transformed a scientific observation into a moral imperative. He asked, without a hint of irony, whether we could afford to let that speck be a stage for war, poverty, and ignorance. The rhetorical question lingered, not as a challenge to scientific fact, but as an appeal to the human capacity for empathy, a capacity that, he argued, is nurtured by wonder. 2 years earlier, on a very different stage, Sagan appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. The audience expected a scientist to deliver a lecture, but Sagan chose instead to describe the universe at the scale of a grain of sand. He said, if you could look at a grain of sand under a powerful microscope, you would see that it is made up of about 10-19 atoms, and each of those atoms is a tiny solar system in its own right. He paused, letting the image settle. Then added, and within that grain there are the building blocks of life, of stars, of everything we know. The humor of the moment was not in the joke, but in the way he used a familiar object, a grain of sand, to evoke the vastness of the cosmos. By making the microcosm a narrative device, Sagan invited the audience to feel the same awe that a poet might feel when describing a sunrise, while simultaneously reinforcing a rigorous scientific point about scale. The segment became a template for future science communicators. Start with the familiar, zoom out, and then bring the audience back to the personal. These stories are not isolated episodes. They are part of a larger philosophical tradition that treats knowledge as narrative. Aristotle, in his Poetics, argued that tragedy is an imitation of action that evokes catharsis through pity and fear. While Aristotle focused on drama, his insight about the power of imitation, of representing reality in a form that moves the audience, applies equally to scientific storytelling. Sagan, in a sense, wrote a new kind of poetics, one where the imitation is of the universe itself, and the emotional response is wonder rather than terror. He understood that the human mind is wired to find meaning in patterns, to seek out stories that explain our place in the world. By framing scientific facts within a story, he was performing a kind of intellectual catharsis, releasing the anxiety that can accompany the enormity of the cosmos and replacing it with a sense of belonging. Yet Sagan's approach was not without its critics. One of the most persistent accusations was that he dumbed down science, that his lyrical style sacrificed rigor for accessibility. Detractors pointed to passages where he used terms like the cosmic ballet or the poetry of the heavens, arguing that such language obscured the underlying mathematics. In response, Sagan often reminded his critics of the distinction between simplification and distortion. He wrote, "If you can't explain a concept in plain language, you either don't understand it or you are protecting your own authority." For Sagan, the goal was not to water down the science, but to distill it to its essential insight without losing its depth. He believed that clarity was a form of respect for the audience, not a concession to laziness. Moreover, he argued that the emotional appeal he cultivated did not compromise objectivity. Rather, it served as a motivational engine, encouraging people to engage with the data themselves. A second line of criticism claimed that emotional appeal could lead to a slippery slope where subjective feelings overrode empirical evidence. Some philosophers warned that the marriage of poetry and data risked turning science into a belief system, akin to religion, where the narrative becomes sacred and the facts are secondary. Sagan addressed this directly in The Demon-Haunted World, asserting that the wonder of the cosmos is not a substitute for evidence, it is a catalyst for seeking evidence. He used the metaphor of a lighthouse. The light of wonder draws ships toward the shore, but the rocks, facts, experiments, peer review still determine whether the ship can safely dock. In this way, he positioned wonder as the initial spark, while the scientific method provides the compass. Modern science communicators have taken Sagan's template and refined it. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who often cites Sagan as his mentor, emphasizes that the story is the vehicle, the data is the cargo. Tyson's own series, Cosmos, A Spacetime Odyssey, builds on the original's narrative foundation while incorporating contemporary visual effects. He also acknowledges the tension between emotional resonance and factual precision, noting that if we lose the sense of awe, we risk losing the public's willingness to fund and support scientific endeavors. In academic circles, scholars such as John Bisley and Alan Irwin have examined the rhetoric of science communication, arguing that narratives are essential for framing scientific issues within cultural values. Their research supports Sagan's intuition. Stories shape how societies prioritize scientific research, from climate change to space exploration. The practical implications of Sagan's narrative philosophy extend far beyond television scripts. In education, teachers who frame lessons as stories of a planet's formation, of a gene's mutation, report higher engagement and retention among students. A study by the National Science Foundation found that classrooms employing narrative techniques saw a 27% increase in conceptual understanding compared to lecture-only formats. In public policy, the framing of scientific data within a compelling narrative can influence legislative outcomes. The 2007 testimony of climate scientist James Hansen before Congress, for instance, combined stark statistical projections with a moral story about intergenerational responsibility, echoing Sagan's blend of fact and ethical appeal. The resulting public discourse helped shape the discourse that led to the Paris Agreement. These real-world applications demonstrate that Sagan's insistence on storytelling is not a stylistic preference, but a strategic necessity for the survival of scientific literacy. Historical anecdotes reinforce the timelessness of this approach. Galileo Galilei, in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, chose to present scientific arguments through a conversational play, allowing readers to experience the conflict between heliocentrism and geocentrism as a drama. Kepler, a contemporary of Galileo, wrote poetry about the harmony of the spheres, believing that the universe's mathematical order could be expressed through verse. Their works predate Sagan by centuries, yet they share his conviction that the mind is more receptive when ideas are couched in narrative form. Sagan, aware of this lineage, often quoted these predecessors, positioning himself as part of a long tradition of poet-scientists. By invoking Galileo's dialogues, Sagan reminded his audience that the struggle to convey truth through story is as old as the scientific revolution itself. Sagan's own literary influences were equally eclectic. He admired the mythic cadence of James Joyce, the precise imagery of Ernest Hemingway, and the philosophical rigor of Immanuel Kant. In Contact, his novel about humanity's first encounter with extraterrestrials, he merged hard science with a love story, creating a narrative that explored both the epistemic and the existential. The novel's protagonist, Dr. Ellie Arroway, is a radio astronomer whose pursuit of signals from the cosmos mirrors the reader's own yearning for connection. Through her, Sagan demonstrates that scientific curiosity is not a cold, detached endeavor. It is a deeply human quest for meaning. The novel's famous line, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself," captures the essence of his narrative philosophy, that the act of scientific discovery is a story we write about ourselves and the universe. To understand how Sagan's storytelling operates on a cognitive level, we can turn to the work of psychologist Jerome Bruner, who argued that narrative is the mode of thought that is most fundamental to human beings. Bruner suggested that people organize their experiences into stories, using them to make sense of the world. When Sagan presented a scientific concept within a narrative arc, setting, conflict, resolution, he aligned his communication with this innate mental structure. The audience could then live the concept rather than merely observe it. This alignment is why his opening monologue of Cosmos feels like an invitation to a pilgrimage rather than a lecture hall announcement. The words, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself," become a refrain that the mind can hum, reinforcing the message each time it is recalled. Sagan's metaphor of the golden record of the mind also serves as a bridge between epistemology and ethics. By likening knowledge to a record, he implies that what we choose to preserve reflects our values. In The Demon-Haunted World, he warns against allowing pseudoscience to overwrite the record, arguing that the danger of the golden record is not that it can be corrupted, but that it can be ignored. This sentiment resonates with contemporary debates over misinformation on digital platforms. The modern record is now a data stream, and the need for a baloney detection kit is more urgent than ever. Sagan's call for critical thinking, framed as a narrative of guardianship, encourages citizens to see themselves as curators of collective knowledge rather than passive recipients. The interplay of metaphor and data is also evident in Sagan's description of the cosmic microwave background as the afterglow of the Big Bang, a faint whisper from the infant universe. The word whisper conveys the subtlety of the signal, while afterglow evokes an image of a dying ember still glowing. These images are not merely decorative, they encode scientific information about temperature, isotropy, and the universe's age. When listeners hear whisper, they intuitively grasp the signal's weakness, and when they imagine an afterglow, they understand that it is a relic of a past event. The metaphor thus functions as a cognitive shortcut, allowing the audience to internalize complex data without sacrificing accuracy. Sagan's narrative method also found fertile ground in the realm of public outreach beyond television. He wrote the Cosmos book series, which combined scientific exposition with lyrical prose, and he authored Billions and Billions, a collection of essays that tackled topics from climate change to the ethics of genetic engineering. In each work, he opened with a vivid anecdote, a child looking up at the night sky, a sailor navigating by the stars, and then unfolded the scientific principles that underpinned those experiences. This structure mirrors the classic Aristotelian rhetorical pattern of exordium, narratio, and peroratio, where the speaker first captures attention, then presents the argument, and finally concludes with a memorable appeal. By adhering to this timeless structure, Sagan ensured that his scientific messages resonated across cultures and generations. The influence of Sagan's storytelling extends into the digital age. Podcasts such as Star Talk and YouTube channels like Kurzgesagt employ a similar blend of narrative, visual metaphor, and data. They often cite Sagan's cosmic perspective as the philosophical foundation for their content. In a 2021 interview, Tyson reflected, "If you look at the history of science communication, Carl Sagan is the fulcrum between the old-school lecture and the modern, multimedia narrative." This observation underscores how Sagan's approach has become a template for translating complex ideas into formats that suit contemporary attention spans while preserving intellectual depth. Yet the debate over emotional appeal versus objectivity persists. In the field of science education, some scholars argue that an over-reliance on narrative can lead to misconceptions, as stories may oversimplify or anthropomorphize phenomena. For example, describing a virus as the enemy can engender fear rather than informed precaution. Sagan anticipated this critique, emphasizing the need for balance. He wrote, "We must never confuse the excitement of the story with the rigor of the method." In practice, this means that after the narrative hook, whether a poetic description of a nebula or a historical anecdote about a failed experiment, must come the transparent presentation of evidence, the acknowledgement of uncertainty, and the invitation for the audience to verify the claims themselves. This two-step approach mirrors the scientific method: hypothesis generation, the story, followed by empirical testing, the data. The modern field of science communication has formalized Sagan's principles into curricula. Courses such as narrative strategies in public science teach students to craft stories that begin with a hook, develop a conflict, a scientific mystery, and resolve it with data. They also train students to anticipate and address counterarguments, a skill Sagan demonstrated repeatedly. When faced with the charge of dumbing down, he would point to the success of Cosmos in inspiring a generation of astronomers, engineers, and policymakers. When critics warned that emotional appeal could bias interpretation, he would cite the robustness of peer review as the safeguard that ensures that the underlying science remains sound, regardless of how it is presented. An often overlooked aspect of Sagan's narrative style is his use of analogies that bridge disparate domains. He famously compared the Earth's atmosphere to a thin veil of a greenhouse, allowing listeners to grasp the greenhouse effect by relating it to a familiar household object. Later, he likened the spread of ideas through culture to the diffusion of gases, a metaphor that helped laypeople understand memetics before the term was coined. These analogies function as cognitive scaffolding, allowing the brain to attach new concepts to existing mental models. When Sagan described the universe's expansion as the surface of a balloon being inflated, he provided a visual that could be grasped without advanced mathematics, yet he always qualified the analogy, noting its limitations. This careful calibration prevented the audience from taking the metaphor as literal truth, thereby preserving scientific integrity. Sagan's storytelling was also deeply ethical. In his 1995 essay, The Pale Blue Dot, he argued that the very act of seeing ourselves as a tiny mote in the vastness of space imposes a moral responsibility. We have to take care of each other, and we have to take care of the Earth. By framing environmental stewardship as a narrative consequence of cosmic perspective, he linked the scientific fact of planetary fragility with an ethical imperative. This narrative strategy has been adopted by contemporary climate communicators, who often begin with vivid depictions of melting ice caps or coral bleaching before presenting the data on carbon emissions. The narrative hook creates an emotional entry point, while the subsequent data grounds the argument in empirical reality. The cross-generational appeal of Sagan's narrative method can be traced to his willingness to engage with other philosophical traditions. He frequently referenced the Buddhist concept of interdependence, noting that the atoms that compose us were once part of distant stars, and that the same atoms will someday return to the cosmos. By weaving in ideas from Eastern philosophy, Sagan broadened the cultural resonance of his stories, showing that scientific wonder is not confined to a Western rationalist framework. This syncretic approach anticipates contemporary calls for a more inclusive science communication that respects diverse worldviews while maintaining methodological rigor. Sagan's influence is evident in the way we begin by asking ourselves what it means to inherit a philosophy that was never written as a systematic treatise, but lived out in television scripts, in public speeches, in the very way Carl Sagan chose to look at the night sky. His legacy is not a closed-book doctrine, but a set of habits of mind, humility before the vastness of the cosmos, a relentless curiosity, and a moral imperative to share knowledge with the widest possible audience. In the 21st century, those habits have become more than nostalgic echoes. They have been woven into the fabric of contemporary debates on climate change, artificial intelligence, and the looming specter of existential risk. Consider first the climate crisis, the planetary emergency that has reshaped the language of policy, science, and popular culture. In 2021, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its sixth assessment report, a document that in its very preface calls for a planetary perspective. That phrase is not a mere bureaucratic buzzword. It is a direct lineage of Sagan's insistence that we see ourselves as a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, as he famously wrote in Pale Blue Dot. The IPCC authors, many of whom grew up watching Cosmos on PBS, explicitly cite Sagan's ability to translate the abstract scales of planetary physics into a moral narrative that compels action. The report's authors argue that only by adopting a planetary perspective, by recognizing that the climate system is a single, interconnected whole, can humanity overcome the parochial interests that have historically stalled meaningful mitigation. In this sense, Sagan's philosophical stance becomes a guiding principle for a scientific community that must persuade not just policymakers, but every citizen that the fate of the Earth is a shared responsibility. The second modern illustration of Sagan's living influence arrives from the realm of space exploration, a field that he helped popularize and that now, in 2023, is experiencing a renaissance through NASA's Artemis program. The Artemis Outreach campaign deliberately mirrors Sagan's narrative style. It blends awe-inspiring visuals of the lunar surface with a conversational tone that invites the public to imagine themselves as participants in humanity's next great adventure. In a series of public videos, the Artemis team uses Sagan's signature cadence, soft, measured, punctuated by pauses that allow the viewer to contemplate the enormity of the moment, while framing the moon as a stepping stone for a sustainable presence beyond Earth. One of the Artemis spokespeople even quoted Sagan directly, "Somewhere, something incredible is waiting for us, and the only way we'll ever know is if we go looking." That echo of Sagan's optimism is not ornamental. It is a strategic rhetorical device designed to build public support, much as Cosmos once did for the Voyager missions. The program's success in generating enthusiasm among younger audiences, many of whom have never known a world without the internet, demonstrates how Sagan's blend of scientific rigor and poetic wonder can be repurposed for contemporary policy agendas. Beyond these headline examples, the influence of Sagan's philosophy can be traced in more subtle, everyday cultural moments. In 2020, a series of TikTok videos went viral, each one pairing a short clip of Sagan's voice taken from the Cosmos archive with modern footage of melting glaciers, raging wildfires, and smog-filled skylines. One video titled "If Sagan Were Here" overlaid the line "We are made of star stuff" onto a time-lapse of a city's smog clearing after a rainstorm, ending with a call to action. Take care of the only home we have. Within weeks, the hashtag #Sagan4Climate amassed millions of views, and the clips were shared by climate activists, educators, and even a few members of Congress. The phenomenon illustrates how Sagan's words have become a meme-like shorthand for scientific urgency, capable of crossing generational and linguistic barriers. The videos did more than entertain. They created a shared vocabulary that frames climate change not as an abstract statistic, but as a moral story in which each of us is a character with agency. A more literal tribute to Sagan's legacy appears on the moon itself. In 2021, the International Astronomical Union approved the naming of a small, bright crater on the lunar far side as Sagan Crater. The decision was driven by a combination of scientific and symbolic considerations. The crater lies near the region explored by the Chinese Chang'e 4 mission, a testament to the new era of multinational lunar exploration that Sagan could only have imagined. The naming ceremony, broadcast by NASA and the European Space Agency, featured a recorded reading of Sagan's words. For small creatures such as we, the vastness is beyond comprehension, yet we can still find meaning in the smallest of our actions. The crater's designation serves as a literal imprint of Sagan's philosophy on the celestial body he spent a lifetime urging us to explore, reminding us that the cosmos is not only a distant arena for scientific inquiry, but also a canvas for human meaning. These anecdotes, while vivid, also invite us to confront the criticisms leveled against Sagan's optimism. Some scholars argue that his hopeful tone masks a naive underestimation of the technological threats that accompany our growing capabilities. Nick Bostrom, a leading philosopher of existential risk, has warned that the very technologies that promise to solve planetary problems, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, nanotechnology, could also become the means of our extinction if mismanaged. Bostrom's superintelligence posits a scenario in which an AI system, designed without sufficient alignment to human values, could rapidly outpace our control mechanisms, leading to outcomes that are, in his words, catastrophic. From this perspective, Sagan's famous assertion that the cosmos is within us might be read as overly anthropocentric, suggesting a confidence that humanity can safely navigate the unknowns of advanced technology. In response, one can draw on Sagan's own acknowledgement of the limits of human knowledge. In The Demon-Haunted World, he warned against the cult of the empty mind, urging a skeptical, evidence-based approach to claims, no matter how seductive. He also warned that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, a principle that directly applies to the development of powerful AI systems. Sagan's optimism, therefore, is not blind faith. It is an optimism grounded in the belief that rational discourse, public education, and transparent governance can mitigate risk. When we examine the current AI governance debates, we see Sagan's influence in the calls for AI literacy among the general public, a movement that mirrors his lifelong mission to democratize scientific understanding. Organizations like the Partnership on AI cite Sagan's style of telling the story of the future as a model for how to engage citizens in policy discussions, ensuring that the development of intelligent systems does not remain the exclusive domain of technocrats. Moreover, Sagan's humility provides a useful counterbalance to both unbridled optimism and fatalistic pessimism. He once said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." This statement does not imply that we are guaranteed to succeed, but rather that our very existence carries intrinsic value as a means of cosmic self-reflection. In the context of existential risk, this humility translates into a precautionary principle. We must proceed, but with an awareness of our fragility. This perspective aligns, perhaps surprisingly, with Peter Singer's utilitarian framework, which evaluates actions based on their capacity to reduce suffering and increase well-being across all sentient beings. Singer's emphasis on effective altruism resonates with Sagan's call for a planetary perspective that extends moral consideration beyond national borders to the biosphere as a whole. Both thinkers converge on the idea that the ethical imperative of the present is to safeguard the future, even if the mechanisms for doing so are imperfect. Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach offers another complementary lens. Nussbaum argues that a just society must provide individuals with the real opportunities to achieve certain essential capabilities: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination, and practical reason, among others. Sagan's advocacy for scientific literacy can be seen as a direct effort to expand the capability of practical reason for the global population. By making the cosmos accessible through television, books, and public talks, he sought to empower people with the imaginative tools needed to envision alternative futures, to ask, what if, in a way that is both scientifically grounded and ethically charged. When we examine modern climate activism, we notice that many campaigns, such as the youth-led Fridays for Future, invoke Sagan's imagery of Earth as a fragile pale blue dot to argue for the protection of these capabilities on a planetary scale. The synergy between Sagan's vision and Nussbaum's framework suggests that fostering scientific imagination is not a luxury, but a prerequisite for any robust conception of human flourishing. Returning to the concrete, the Artemis program's outreach strategy also exemplifies how Sagan's narrative techniques can be repurposed to address contemporary concerns about space debris and planetary protection. In a recent live-streamed event, an astronaut recited Sagan's words, "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is beyond comprehension, yet we can still find meaning in the smallest of our actions," before unveiling a new policy to limit lunar surface contamination. The rhetorical choice to frame policy in the language of wonder and responsibility mirrors the way Sagan linked scientific facts to moral imperatives. It is a reminder that the same poetic framing that once inspired a generation to look up at the night sky can also be wielded to persuade governments to adopt sustainable practices in space, a domain that, like the climate, suffers from the tragedy of the commons. The IPCC's planetary perspective, too, draws from Sagan's insistence that the Earth is not a collection of isolated nations, but a single, living system. In the report's synthesis, the authors write, humanity must act as a planetary species, recognizing that the health of the climate is inseparable from the health of human societies. This language echoes Sagan's 1994 address to the United Nations, where he warned, "We are the custodians of this planet, and we have a responsibility to protect it for future generations." The resonance is unmistakable. Sagan's moral framing has become a template for the kind of integrative language required to galvanize global cooperation. Yet, the critiques remain potent. Critics like Bostrom argue that Sagan's optimism may underplay the speed and scale at which technological risks can materialize. They point to the rapid development of deep learning models, which have gone from academic curiosities to powerful tools capable of generating synthetic media, influencing elections, and automating weapons systems, all within a decade. In this view, the cosmic perspective that Sagan championed might be insufficient if humanity cannot keep pace with its own creations. The counter-argument, however, is that Sagan's optimism is not a denial of risk, but a call to embed risk awareness into the very fabric of scientific culture. He would likely have welcomed Bostrom's cautionary scenarios, not as a repudiation of hope, but as a necessary component of the dialogue that keeps humanity vigilant. To illustrate how this dialogue can take shape, consider the emerging field of AI safety research, which now includes interdisciplinary teams of computer scientists, ethicists, and philosophers. The AI alignment community frequently cites Sagan's emphasis on the responsibility of the public to understand the scientific method as a guiding principle. Their outreach efforts, public webinars, open-source educational videos, and even interactive simulations that let participants explore the consequences of different AI governance choices, mirror Sagan's approach to democratizing complex ideas. By inviting laypeople into the conversation, they aim to create a societal, planetary perspective on AI, just as the IPCC seeks one on climate. The interplay between Sagan's legacy and contemporary philosophical thought also invites us to examine the role of narrative in shaping public policy. Peter Singer's utilitarianism, with its focus on outcomes, can sometimes appear cold or abstract. Sagan's storytelling, however, adds an effective dimension that makes the abstract tangible. When Singer writes about the moral obligation to prevent suffering, he often relies on statistical arguments. Sagan, on the other hand, would have painted a picture of a child looking up at the night sky, feeling both awe and responsibility. The two approaches are not mutually exclusive, they complement each other. By pairing rigorous cost-benefit analysis with vivid, emotionally resonant narratives, policymakers can both justify and inspire action. Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach likewise benefits from Sagan's narrative style. While Nussbaum articulates the specific capabilities that should be protected, Sagan supplies the cosmic context that elevates those capabilities from mere human concerns to universal ones. He reminds us that the very capacity for imagination, one of Nussbaum's central capabilities, is what allows us to conceive of life beyond Earth, to dream of habitats on Mars, and to envision a future where humanity lives in harmony with its planetary home. In this sense, Sagan's cosmic humility expands the ethical horizon of the capabilities approach, urging us to consider not just what we can do for each other, but what we can do for the cosmos that made us possible. The practical implications of this synthesis can be seen in the way educational curricula are being redesigned. Several university programs now offer interdisciplinary courses titled Cosmic Ethics or Planetary Responsibility, directly drawing from Sagan's works, Singer's utilitarian calculations, and Nussbaum's capability framework. In these courses, students are asked to evaluate climate mitigation strategies not only for their economic efficiency, but also for how they enhance or diminish the capabilities of future generations, and for how they reflect a humble recognition of our place in the universe. The syllabus often includes primary readings from Cosmos, The Demon-Haunted World, Singer's The Life You Can Save, and Nussbaum's Frontiers of Justice, encouraging students to navigate the intersections of science, philosophy, and policy. The viral TikTok series from 2020 provides a vivid illustration of how this interdisciplinary blend can be communicated in a format that reaches billions. One clip juxtaposes a clip of Sagan's voice saying, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself," with footage of a solar farm rising over a desert landscape. The caption reads, "Our technology can be a beacon of hope if we use it wisely." The comment section is filled with users debating the ethics of renewable energy deployment, citing Singer's arguments about the greatest good for the greatest number, while also invoking Nussbaum's call for equitable access to the capabilities that clean energy provides. This spontaneous, grassroots discussion demonstrates how Sagan's poetic framing can catalyze sophisticated philosophical debate in the public sphere. The naming of Sagan Crater, meanwhile, offers a tangible reminder that scientific achievement and philosophical reflection are not separate realms. When the International Astronomical Union announced the designation, the accompanying press release quoted Sagan's reflection on the moon. It is a world that reminds us of both our smallness and our capacity for greatness. The crater, located near the far side South Pole Aitken Basin, is now a point of reference for lunar geologists mapping the moon's ancient impact history. Its very existence on official lunar maps serves as a daily reminder to researchers that their work is part of a larger narrative about humanity's place in the cosmos, a narrative that Sagan himself helped author. In the realm of existential risk, the conversation becomes more nuanced. Bostrom's scenarios about superintelligent AI often invoke a hard takeoff, where an AI rapidly surpasses human control. Sagan's response, were he alive today, might have drawn upon his own reflections on the vastness of space as a metaphor for the unknown dimensions of future technology. He once said, "The universe is a pretty big place. If it's a big place, it's also a place where the improbable can happen." By acknowledging the improbability of certain outcomes, he did not deny their possibility. Instead, he would likely have advocated for a cosmic caution, a stance that encourages preparation without succumbing to fatalism. This stance dovetails with Singer's principle of preventing suffering where it can be most effectively avoided, and with Nussbaum's insistence on preserving the capability of practical reason so that future generations can make informed choices about the technologies they inherit. The practical outworking of this cosmic caution can be seen in the recent establishment of the Global AI Governance Forum, a coalition of governments, NGOs, and private firms that convenes annually to discuss standards for AI safety. The forum's charter explicitly references Sagan's call for transparent, open dialogue about the frontiers of knowledge. Its working groups produce policy briefs that combine rigorous technical assessments with narrative framing designed to resonate with the public. One brief, for example, opens with a quotation from Sagan: "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is beyond comprehension, yet we can still find meaning in the smallest of our actions." It then proceeds to outline concrete steps for ensuring that AI systems are aligned with human values, illustrating how Sagan's poetic language can be a bridge to concrete policy. In assessing the legacy of Carl Sagan for the 21st century, we must also recognize that his influence extends beyond the realms of climate and technology. It permeates the very way we conceive of public intellectualism. Sagan believed that the scientist's role was not merely to discover facts, but to translate those facts into stories that could guide collective action. He argued that science is more than a body of knowledge, it is a way of thinking, a way